Lord Worpleston's relations included an uncle called the Honourable Derek Cray, younger brother of the second Earl, an elderly gentleman of no fixed abode, who might be described as a professional guest. His year was planned as a circuit, passing from one country house to another. A bed-sitting room in Ebury Street was his only address, and that is where he kept his wardrobe, repacking there so as to be suitably dressed for the time of year. He had lived extravagantly in early life, and now had paid the penalty, being detailed to read to the bedridden, push the wheelchair, or take the children to the pantomime. His visits to Worpley Maltravers were usually timed to coincide with some sporting event which would take the Earl elsewhere, as it might be to Goodwood or to Ascot. After the pattern of Uncle Derek's life had been explained to him, and somewhat to the mystification of the butler, Jeeves offered to act as valet to this particular guest. In due course Uncle Derek arrived, and was shown to one of the smaller guest rooms, the one which overlooked the kennels. When Jeeves reported for duty and offered to unpack for him, he expressed some surprise.
"But who are you, young man? I seem to recall that I have seen you handing round the Brussels sprouts in the capacity of footman."
"I am to act as your valet, sir."
I see. Do you know anything about a valet's job?"
"I am quick to learn, sir."
"And you wish me to teach you? Very wise of you, young man. But I warn you that it is I who will expect the tip at the end of my visit."
"Very good, sir. Shall I unpack for you now?"
"No. This time you can watch me. In the days when I could afford a valet, I learnt from him how to pack a suitcase correctly. The secret is to do things in the right order, don't you know? For instance, the sponge bag should always be the last item to be packed, and it should be insulated."
Once he had learnt how to pack and unpack, how to sponge and iron every conceivable garment a gentleman might wear, Jeeves was then handed a number of volumes from which he learnt the order of precedence, the sequence in which orders and medals are displayed, and the significance of the ties worn, whether associated with school, college, regiment, or club. On Uncle Derek's fourth visit, Jeeves was to learn that a valet must also know how to cook. He need not be able to serve a 7-course dinner or even a particularly formal luncheon, but his preparation of breakfast must be impeccable, and a supper fit for a bachelor's table should not be beyond his skill. Nor should he be ignorant of whisky, gin, sherry, or the main type of aperitif, for the occasion may arise when there is no butler at hand, as there are bachelor establishments indeed where no butler is ever seen. It was after Kempton Park, during Jeeves' second year at Worpley Maltravers, that Vesey asked leave of absence to visit his ailing grandmother at Bury St. Edmunds. His devotion to her did him credit, but his 3 weeks' absence might have seemed excessive had not Jeeves been able to take his place. When a similar period of absence followed his success at Doncaster, it gradually dawned on the Lord that Vesey's winnings were always spent on a prolonged orgy of dissipation. It also became apparent that his deputy, Jeeves, was a better valet than Vesey had ever been. Vesey's absence after Goodwood was thus made final, he being told that he need not return. So it came about that Jeeves was replaced as second footman and promoted to the higher rank of valet. When the Earl attended the Cambridgeshire, Jeeves now accompanied him. When the Earl was at Newmarket, Jeeves was there too. For the rest of his life, Jeeves was to be a persistent and successful backer of horses, but one who never celebrated any success in champagne. Avoiding the mistake made by Vesey and many another punter, he paid his winnings into a deposit account, thus building up a fortune on which he would eventually retire. Jeeves knew little about fashionable London until he came to live in Cadogan Square as valet to the Honourable Digby Thistleton, best known for the gossip column he contributed to the Morning Courier. Mr. Thistleton lived in the house of his grandfather, the Duke of Hampshire, who, though relatively impoverished, still had his own valet, the reliable Mr. Arthur Mitchell. It was he who proposed Jeeves as a member of the Junior Ganymede Club in Curzon Street, and it was he who told Jeeves the salient facts about the Drones Club, whose premises were nearby at number 16 Dover Street. Always quick to learn, Jeeves soon realised that London is, for all practical purposes, an area bounded by Oxford Street on the north, Regent Street on the east, the Mall to the south, and Park Lane to the west. It was true, he discovered, that some people of consequence might live in a further area bounded by Knightsbridge, Grosvenor Place, Pimlico Road, and Sloane Street. Later he was told that other people lived north of the park, in places like Lancaster Gate and Portman Square. Accepting such hearsay at its face value, he realised, nevertheless, that life could not be lived to the full except in Mayfair. The Junior Ganymede was a club with a membership restricted to gentlemen's personal gentlemen, together with a few footmen and chauffeurs, and a small and strictly limited number of butlers. The Junior Ganymede was perhaps chiefly famous for its club book, compiled under Rule 11, by which members contributed full information about their employers, including an estimate of their intelligence, if any, on a scale marked from 1 to 10, and a final assessment of their relative sanity. To these basic facts were added some notes about hobbies and habits, lapses and loves, with anecdotes added to illustrate character or to entertain the members of the club. It was while studying this club book that Jeeves came to realise that the Junior Ganymede's bachelor employers were nearly all members of the Drones Club. As Arthur Mitchell explained to him, the requirements for membership were not very demanding.
The qualifications for entry, Jeeves, are purely negative. While other clubs insist that members have perhaps served in the brigade or cavalry, or are active in Tory or Liberal interest, or perhaps prominent in the church or upon the stage, the Drones cannot be said to have achieved anything, not even so much as a commission or a degree. All they have in common is that their clothes are correct, their ties match their socks, and most of them employ as valet a member of the Junior Ganymede Club.
A typical Drones member was the Honourable Mr. Digby Thistleton himself. All that singled him out from the other Drones was that he possessed ambition and a measure of enterprise. Who but he would have tried to market a mob dispersal mist in Buenos Aires? A cellar in Curzon Street was his laboratory, and he worked there for hours, but Jeeves observed that he spent most of his time on plans for marketing and publicity. As Mr. Thistleton explained it to Jeeves,
"It's not what you sell, Jeeves, me old fruit. It's how you sell it that counts, don't you know? How you sell it. That's what counts."
On hearing this, Thistleton's friends were wont to sigh deeply, tapping their heads and exchanging significant glances. But eventually the course of time was to prove Thistleton right and his friends wrong, though this was far from apparent when he first tried to place his invention antibarb on the market. Antibarb, a derivative of the mob dispersal mist, was originally marketed as a depilatory. By way of a test, it was first offered for sale in a restricted area south of the river. It immediately brought Thistleton a spate of vituperative correspondence. Reading between the lines, and ignoring the misspelling of the more abstruse words, like blackguard, Thistleton gradually realised that his product was not serving the purpose for which it was sold. Hair, it seemed, was practically the only thing it did not destroy. It had, however, paralysed a retired policeman and killed a pet rabbit. Thistleton puzzled over this, and simply refused to believe that his mixture could serve no useful purpose. His motto, "There is always a way," was repeated daily with growing emphasis but diminishing confidence. Its truth was proved, though, on a morning when the mail comprised only a single letter, postmarked from Jamaica Road. The sender, in demanding her money back, stated that Auntie Bob had actually encouraged the growth of the underarm hair which she had been trying to remove. Thistleton then had his flash of inspiration. What he had discovered was actually a hair restorer, and should now be marketed as such. After prolonged thought, he decided to call it Hair O, using as his first advertisement a picture of a billiard ball before and after the stuff had been applied. Was it effective? Any generalization on this point would be rash, though we know of at least one case in which the remedy failed to produce any visible result. Jeeves had by this time in his career a receding hairline, which would have added to his dignity as a butler, but which detracted from what had so far been a youthful appearance. After 4 months of regular application of Hair O, the tide had ebbed by another 1/4 inch. Gazing into the mirror, Jeeves had to admit to himself that the onset of middle age had begun. If Jeeves had this inner feeling of sadness, his employer, Digby Thistleton, was on top of the world. The Mayfair Pharmaceutical Company had moved to larger premises, no longer in a basement, and Thistleton himself had left his grandfather's home for a penthouse flat in Park Lane. He was already a respected member of the Carlton Club, having resigned from the Drones, where he was known now to be richer than Uffe Prosser, and there were rumours about his impending knighthood. By that time Jeeves had ceased to be his valet, and for a reason which need cause no surprise. It was plainly impossible for the chairman of the Mayfair Pharmaceutical Group to employ a servant with a receding hairline. He had no complaint about Jeeves' character or work. His only failure, as Jeeves readily understood, was as a living advertisement for Hair O. A replacement had to be found, and so Digby Thistleton, now Lord Bridgeworth, bade Jeeves a reluctant farewell. Following his departure from the service of Digby Thistleton, Jeeves returned to the Junior Ganymede Club and sought the help of the famous Junior Ganymede Club book to find new employment. He was particularly attracted by the entry of a certain Lord Frederick Ranelagh, who was principally resident in Monte Carlo and had recently lost his valet. And indeed, when he called round at the Albany on the off chance, he had no difficulty in convincing Lord Frederick that he should enter his service. Had Jeeves not been desperate, he might not have rushed in so speedily. But if nothing else, it would be true to say that his visit to Monte Carlo completed his education. It was in the service of Lord Frederick that Jeeves learned how to control his expression and remain completely impassive, a skill, it might be said, that Lord Frederick himself had never acquired. For Jeeves' employer's one great weakness was for the game of poker. What seems odd in retrospect is that Lord Frederick thought himself an ace player, when he actually was not. He therefore boldly invited poker players on board his yacht, and would seem to have done well enough against novice opponents. It was only a question of time, however, before he ran into trouble. He met his Waterloo when he threw a careless invitation to Mr. Montague Todd. Had the name been Sir Jasper Todd, the notorious property developer, he might have seen the danger. But this was Sir Jasper's younger brother, a man of whom his lordship had never heard. The stag dinner party went off well, and Lord Frederick was rash enough to tell his guests of a recent incident in which Jeeves had saved him from what would have been indecent assault. He told this story when Jeeves was out of the room, and Mr. Todd showed great interest, remarking that Jeeves must be a useful man to have around. Lord Frederick agreed that he was indeed. The talk ended soon afterwards, and the card game began. The details of play are not germane to the issue, but as Mr. Todd's pile of chips rose higher and higher, Lord Frederick's dwindled to nothing. The point came when he had to admit that his gambling debt exceeded all the money he possessed. After a minute of embarrassed silence, Mr. Todd caused a sensation when he thumped the table and said,
"What about Jeeves?"
Well, what about Jeeves?
Well, you could stake him at an agreed valuation.
Great Scott! But I can't compel him to enter your service. The man is beyond price anyway.
You can sack him, and I should have thought you needed to do that anyway. Then you can tell him of my offer, 50% more than his present wage.
If I lose him, I shall expect you to cancel everything I owe you.
I agree. I place on the table my cigarette lighter, representing Jeeves. That is Lord Frederick's stake. Dealer, the buck is with you.
The game was resumed. You should recall that poker, unlike many other card games, is a game not of luck, but of skill. The result was inevitable, and the moment came when Lord Frederick stared at the cards and whispered in a stricken voice,
I've lost Jeeves.
The party broke up, and his lordship spent a sleepless night. He felt all too much like one who is to be shot at dawn, and who wonders, as many such a victim must wonder, why it could not be done at a more reasonable hour. Lord Frederick sent for Jeeves after breakfast.
I regret to say that I lost heavily at cards last night. I lost pretty well all I have. The result is I must cut down on my domestic staff. With infinite regret, I've decided for the time being to do without a valet. This moment would be even more painful for me if I could not tell you at the same time of another place that is offered you at a higher wage. When I told Mr. Todd of my financial predicament, he said at once that he would be glad to have you in his service. May I tell him that you will accept?
I appreciate your tact, Lord Frederick, and will accept the offer. You need not, however, have invented a story. I was on deck last night and watched your game through the skylight.
So it came about that Jeeves entered the service of Montague Todd, a period of his life which he was afterwards to look back on with no satisfaction at all. It is a fact that to achieve eminence in the dignified profession of being a gentleman's gentleman depends in the first place upon the employer being a gentleman. It was when inspecting Mr. Todd's wardrobe that Jeeves' heart began to sink. Mr. Todd had a second-floor suite at the Panamericana Hotel, and the cupboard space, which was ample and lined in polished hardboard, contained all the clothes which a valet could expect to find. The suits were expensive and came from Savile Row, but the patterns were loud and the cut flashy. The shirts were individually tailored in Jermyn Street. The ties were in woven silk. The socks came from the Burlington Arcade and the shoes from McPhee, but the total effect was mere disaster. After infinite expense and care, Mr. Todd looked like something the cat had brought in. A cat, moreover, with an outstanding lack of discrimination. Not for the first time since he had left the safety of Mayfair did Jeeves wonder whether he had made a terrible mistake. Certainly Jeeves had barely been in the service of Mr. Montague Todd for a few days before he began to nurture some grave doubts about the suitability of his new employer. At this time, the members of the Junior Ganymede Club in Monte Carlo numbered about 9. Not enough to form a local branch, but enough to justify a weekly gathering at the Café Florentine in the Rue Suffren-Raymond. It was in this congenial and well-informed circle that Jeeves came to hear about the dubious transactions for which Mr. Montague Todd and his notorious property developer brother Sir Jasper were well known in the city. Old Tom Atwell, who had been valet to a Lord of Appeal for 70 years, was only one who warned Jeeves against being associated with the Todds, lest he himself wind up in court as a witness, or worse still, as a suspect. Jeeves, though, took a somewhat different view. As he put it to Mr. Atwell, he was somewhat less perturbed about Mr. Todd's criminal offences than he was concerning his offences against good taste.
Mr. Todd uses glycerol on his hair. It is the sort of stuff used by yokels on market day.
That is not true. I've known gentlemen who have used glycerol. Not many, I'll admit. Some 2 or 3.
But he also uses Daslow toothpaste, which smells of aniseed.
That's a more serious matter. Daslow is strictly for working-class Italians. No gentleman ever uses Daslow. About that, there can be no argument at all.
But there is worse to follow, Mr. Atwell. Mr. Todd also uses Seductor aftershave lotion.
Not really. Enough, Mr. Jeeves. Seductor as well as Daslow. The mind recoils at such a disgusting combination. This is not to be endured. You must leave that man's service at once.
Faced with appalling clothes and revolting smells, Jeeves would have resigned, no doubt, at an early date. But an event was to take place which would save him from making that decision. On a fine morning in June, and at the usual hour, Jeeves came to Mr. Todd's bedroom, drew the curtains, and wished his master good morning. But there was no reply, a fact easily accounted for in that Mr. Todd was not there. The bed, which had not been occupied, was empty, so was the adjacent bathroom, and so was the rest of the suite. Mr. Todd had vanished, and his absence was accounted for by a note pinned neatly to the pillow. It was written in block capitals on the back of yesterday's luncheon menu. Jeeves picked it up and read it.
Now, what have we here? Montague Todd is the prisoner of the Young Levellers Liberation Army and will be released on receipt of £500,000 payable into account number 537-26449 at the Supranational Bank, Geneva, failing which payment by noon on Friday the 21st, he will be executed as an enemy of the people.
Having read some detective fiction, Jeeves touched nothing in the suite, and from the hotel reception desk telephoned the hotel manager, the chief of police, and Mr. Cedric Snodgrass, Montague Todd's seedy financial and legal adviser. The 4 of them quickly discovered that the mystery of Todd's disappearance was even greater than first appeared. The kidnapping had evidently taken place between 1:30 in the morning, when Todd had been observed by the hall porter returning to the hotel, and 8 in the morning, when the maid, receiving no reply to her knock, had found him missing. But the puzzling facts were that there was no sign of any resistance. Nobody had seen him leave the hotel, and there were positively no signs of a struggle. Moreover, it appeared that Todd had taken nothing with him but his pyjamas, leaving behind not only the purple and gold monstrosity that was his dressing gown, but also his passport, his driving licence, and his cheque-book. The 4 of them were gathered in Todd's room, scratching their heads, when there came a knock upon the door. It opened, and round the edge came a bald, egg-shaped head with a large moustache of military aspect and a pair of eagle eyes which plainly, immediately assimilated everything in the room. The newcomer spoke.
Mille fois pardon, monsieur. My name is Hercule Poirot. I have been retained by Sir Jasper Todd to investigate this most curious circumstance. It is plain beyond all shadow of a doubt that this foul crime was the work of a group of professionals. Consider what they would seem to have done. They have soundlessly entered a hotel which is locked, barred, guarded, and watched. They have passed the night porter, an ex-sous officer of an integrity which is absolute. They have kidnapped a guest and taken him out of the hotel in his pajamas, without so much as his dressing gown or overcoat. Our own brain cells must exercise themselves in this case. We are dealing with people who have brains.
The revelation that Lord Peter Wimsey had been employed to solve the mystery of the kidnapping of Montague Todd did not please Hercule Poirot in the least. Convinced, as he was, that an exceptionally talented band of professional criminals had abducted Todd, he advised that the only solution was for the ransom to be paid forthwith. Since Todd had been insured against this very eventuality, nobody would be the loser, apart, of course, from the insurers. They, naturally enough, had different views on the matter. Hence they had hired the famous Lord Peter, who wasted no time arriving on the scene. It would be interesting to learn that Lord Peter discarded Poirot's theory at the outset, having found one of his own. On the contrary, as it turned out, he treated Poirot's theory with respect. The only area in which the two great detectives were in dispute was in the action that they suggested Montague Todd's supporters should take. On the day after Wimsey's arrival, another meeting was held in Mr. Todd's suite, attended on this occasion by the same four as previously, with the exception of the shady Cedric Snodgrass and the addition of Lord Peter. And Lord Peter it was who addressed the gathering.
It's jolly good of you all to come along. I hope it wasn't shockingly inconvenient and all that. I just want to get a picture, don't you know, of what happened. Mr. Todd was at a cabaret called the Birds of Paradise. I've already interviewed Mr. Snodgrass, eh, what? He told me the girls in the cabaret were pretty hot stuff, but unfortunately the star of the show, Olga Orloff, the fan dancer, had a bad cold and her understudy was a poor substitute. Anyway, it appears they left about 1:15, and Todd was driven back to his hotel by this Snodgrass chappie. Now, at this point, I believe there was a substitution. Monty went off into captivity, and someone else, disguised as Monty, entered the hotel, came into this room, hung up his evening clothes, put on his pyjamas, and then vanished into thin air. Now, I've got no proof, but to my mind, there's no doubt about the truth, eh? This Snodgrass has got to be an out-and-out bounder, what? Snake in the grass, nigger in the woodpile. Must have stashed poor old Monty away somewhere and substituted himself. Pity is, we've got no proof. No proof at all.
So it came about that Lord Peter Wimsey rejected Hercule Poirot's recommendations and took an opposite course of action. Convinced that Todd's life was in no danger, he accordingly reported to the insurance company that no ransom should be paid. That Lord Peter Wimsey had so advised became public knowledge in a matter of days, with the unexpected result that there was a new demand for ransom, posted this time to Jeeves in a letter with a Villefranche postmark.
It's from the kidnappers. Montague Todd is still a prisoner under sentence of death. The ransom of £500,000 should now be paid into account number 54618333175 at the Credit Universal at Bern, failing which payment he will be executed on Friday the 28th of June at noon.
With both Hercule Poirot and Lord Peter Wimsey unable to throw any further light on the affair, it was the hotel manager, Jean Delacroix, a devout Catholic, who finally pointed the way to the solution. While in confession to his old friend Father Lagrange, he learned that at the nearby convalescent home of the Redemption there was temporarily residing an English priest who had a reputation for elucidating mysteries which were beyond the skill of the police. Delacroix was nevertheless a little disappointed when he met Father Brown, for it was he, for the first time. How on earth could he be expected to succeed where Poirot and Wimsey had been baffled? What truth could he find which had been hidden from them? The little priest blinked about him uncertainly, and finally addressed himself to his expectant audience.
The solution, my friends, is quite simple. It's as plain as the nose on my face that Mr. Montague Todd has arranged this matter himself in order to obtain the insurance money. Let me put myself in Mr. Todd's place. I want to disappear for a time. I want to vanish until the ransom has been paid. How do I set about it? How do I hide? Well, if you wanted to hide a pebble, you'd hide it on the beach. And if you wanted to hide a leaf, you would hide it in a forest. So where would you hide a holidaymaker? Obviously, in an hotel. And which hotel would you choose? Of course, the hotel from which he is missing. Why? Because inquiries will be made at all the other hotels.
It was at this point that Jeeves had his inspiration. Rising silently as always, he slipped noiselessly from the room and headed for the servants' quarters. A few minutes later he returned.
I am pleased to be able to announce that Mr. Todd is resident at this moment in room 417 on the 4th floor. If I may explain. A gentleman who adopts a disguise may change his clothes, his hair colour, his complexion, and his accent. Spinoza observes that men govern nothing with more difficulty than their tongues, but here the philosopher is surely wrong. It is their habits they fail to govern. Having changed everything else, a man who assumes a disguise will probably retain the same toothpaste, hair wash, and aftershave lotion. Mr. Todd's tastes, gentlemen, are peculiar, for he prefers glycerol, Dazzlo, and Seductor, products of which few real gentlemen would make use, and none, surely, would use all three. I have just questioned the chambermaids who cleaned the bathrooms, and only one of them reported the presence of all three substances. I ventured to offer a small reward. If you thought my own services deserve any recognition, gentlemen, I should not refuse a sum equivalent to my fare back to England.
The reward being forthcoming, Jeeves returned to London. Being unemployed, he naturally headed straight for the Junior Ganymede Club, where the famous club book was to lead him to the most important encounter of his life.